Hey, Chanel here with another Sew Bit. Today's topic is about bias tape. What is bias tape? I have a little container full of them. I have a couple of these. These are, I literally have things in here that people have donated to my school. I think they're probably from the 1950s. But they're all still packaged, and I just kind of keep some different colors in here because you always need bias tape in your sewing. But what is bias tape? I get that question a lot in sewing, and it's something more like after you get out of beginner sewing you start using. But this would be a bias tape. So if you saw the Sew Bit last week on grain lines, I talked a little bit about bias because there's the length grain, the cross grain, and then the bias grain, which is the 45-degree angle that goes through a fabric, and it has a really nice stretch, and it has to be cut perfectly on that 45-degree angle to get an even stretch. And that's what these are when you buy them packaged. They're just all, lined up and cut straight. But this is called a wide single fold bias, so you notice it folds out like that. And then you have that fold here, and the goal is to stitch that in there and then roll it over a seam. You can use it as an armhole facing, a neckline facing. You can cover seams with it. And the slight stretch in it helps it go over curves. So if you've seen the Sew Bit on clipping the curves, sounds like a song. When you clip the fabric and when anything's on a curve, there's a lot of curves in sewing, and then you flip it over, the fabric just lays really straight. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But this is a extra wide double fold. This a lot of quilters will use to bind their quilts, like the edges right here, because they're wider. This is about 3/4 of an inch, and it's actually, I think they have to cut a put this on the dress. This one's about a 3.5 inch wide piece right there, and then it's folded over. This is actually used. This right here is a bias maker. Actually, it's not really a maker. You cut the fabric and you put it through here, and it helps you press it. I'll show you that in a second too. But again, right here, this is a single fold. A thinner one, this is about maybe 1/2 inch wide, and you can see it folds out like that. And I'll show you how they use that too. But this is a much thinner one that I'm surprised this is in my little kit because I hardly ever use these, but they're actually good. This would be good just to cover seams. So this is a double fold, but it's only like 1/4 inch wide. And then, I don't know if they still make these, but I found this in my little bin. It was 15 cents, so this must have been from the 40s or something. But they had it in prints. I bet they still have a couple prints out there. It's kind of cute. So that'd be fun. It's just all packaged up. I don't want to unpackage it. Maybe I can make thousands on it. It's an antique. No. Anyway, so I made my own bias tape here. That was where I used this thing. And what you do is you cut the strips. I'm going to show you how to do that. But this actually feeds through here. Let's see. Hard to do it up on the thing. You'll feed it through here, comes out the other end, and then it folds. This one's already pressed, so it looks a little easier. But then you have your iron right here, and as you're pulling it, you're pressing the seams down. And once you get it in there, caught in there right, it evenly folds those pieces. And then what I used it for was I was making these aprons. I had my students doing them, and we just like made the apron piece. It was a little half apron, and this cupped over the raw edges, and then you stitch on it, and it became the tie and everything too. So I made rows and rows of these. This is also how bias is connected. It's not sewn like this is a square edge. It's not sewn straight on square. It's actually a seam that goes across like this, and then you usually have these little peaks coming out, and that's what I find trips up a lot of my students, is when these peaks come out. They want them to match up, but actually when you then fold it out, then it matches. This one's actually just a tad off there, but it's still, one side was a little longer. It's about It's an eighth of an inch off there. But that's how you put bias pieces together. This is actually I'm going to show you there's a pattern here. I think it was this one right here. There's this top, and they didn't have a facing in the top. They actually had it, this is the instructions here, that's the opening. So they put the bias tape around the neckline. And if you notice, they have like a little bit of the shaded part here. They didn't put the end of the bias right up to the edge of this. They actually put it a little closer. So this is a kind of a mock-up example of that pattern. And so they have a little bit peaked here because the fold out on this bias is only like 1/4 of an inch. And if you had to sew this down at 5/8 or so, you know, obviously that one's longer. So what I did was I sewed it along here, then I clipped the curves right here. That helps it roll in. And then this bias rolls inside like that, and you press it. You actually press it first, then you roll it to the inside, and then it hides right underneath there. And then that's how you can finish off curved edges. So like if you have a sleeveless top, there's a definite curve in the arm's eye there, and then you put the bias tape that way, and then it curves it off. So here's actually some samples of some bias. I pulled these out of my closet. This I made a long time ago, but I finished off, this was just a bodice piece here, that the raw edges are all there, and I finished it all off with bias, the bias edge, and that's the inside of it. So the whole thing was finished off on the, it actually really makes it easier because you don't have to put it right sides together, turn it all inside out and stuff. You actually just put the bias edge on it. Here's another gown that I made. I made this out of, so the fabric, I found a perfect silk charmeuse that matched this fabric, and then I just put bias edging throughout this whole thing right here. So I actually put it into the yoke and everywhere, and I think even the end of the skirt. So there's the skirt slit right here, and it all just blended in together, and that was the whole finish work there. I put the lining over that. I had the perfect color lining there, but the inside of it looks like this. It actually has some tape left on it because in Hollywood we tape everything to you because we don't want any, you know, Janet Jackson didn't have any top stick tape on her. That's why her top flew off. Anyway, this is another bias treatment here. This is actually just used for trim. It's just a bias single layer strip, and the bias, when you cut it too on the bias, it doesn't fray on the ends right here, so there's no fraying right here like that. But this is a bias trim that I just set in to a seam. I actually used I used a fat quarter, batik fat quarter, and it just, you know, it's a little piece of fabric, and I cut the bias in there. It was pretty cool. Here's another skirt I just made, and this has the opposite colors. So I did a brown bias. This is a fold over bias here, and then on the other side I did the black bias. So you can use bias for design, and you can also use it for function as far as covering up seams and also you know, finishing off edges and stuff. So that's a little bit about bias. I'm actually going to now show you how you would cut some bias strips. It's pretty simple. Okay, how to cut some bias. So I have a piece of fabric here. I got my cross grain lined up on the cutting board here. It's torn, so I know it's the exact on the cross grain. Then I have the selvage right here, and that's lined up on my cutting board too. And then if you have a 45-degree angle ruler here, that really helps, because what you do is you can put it on, say on your selvage here, which is definitely the length grain, and then you can trace, or I use it to get it started, and then then you get your ruler out, and then you finish it, you finish the line. And that is actually a true bias cut. So that's on the bias. You got your cross grain here, your left grain here, and then your bias. So let's say if I want to do a 2-inch bias strip, but by the time I fold it in half and everything, it's definitely not 2 inches wide anymore. If you actually want 2 inches, I think you have to cut 4 inches. So here's a bias strip here. If you don't have 45-degree angle, let's say you wanted to find your 45-degree angle. Let's say I go from here to 10 inches. And then on the cross grain, so you got length grain and the cross grain, 10 inches right there. And then you connected the 2 dots at 10 and 10. There's a bias grain going that way. See, bias has a really nice stretch right here, nice even stretch when it's exactly on that 45-degree angle. If you're kind of cockeyed here, you get weird stretches too. So there's a bias strip, and what they do to make those tapes is they actually just, you know, they cut all these lines, but you actually have to really make sure you get this part on the straight, one of the, you know, cross grain or length grain right here. Like actually this was cut over here, so it's not exactly even, but I would maybe get this on my ruler here and get that straight and even, because I'll show you, because it's how you connect these. Then you actually just cut your strips out like this. And if you have a slippery fabric, these really challenging to cut these out, because it just moves everywhere. Because this will this just has a really wild stretch here. But now you have the 2 ends right here, and how you would match these up is you want to put right side. So I have a right side here and a right side there. They would actually, you'd have to use another piece. I'd have to go into the other side right here. You see how this is crooked? But let's say these were both right sides. These actually, if you would line them up like this, so you see they're going to go straight, and then you turn it this way, then you pin it, and then stitch right here like that, and you have a connection right there. And that's how this was done here. It's all connected, and that's what I was showing you before, where those little peaks poke out here. So they would go this way, and then you're a little bit here. This trips up a lot of my students, that they want to go like this, but then you can see if you do that, it doesn't match up by the time you actually get the seam. This actually allows for the seam. So that's a little bit about bias strips. Try it. It will improve your sewing like crazy. It'll really help put out, make some things easier and give you really great options for details. See you in the next sew bit.